This conference will now be recorded.
Hi all, this is a presentation on hedgerows and utilization of the hedgerows, not only to increase biodiversity conservation, but also the role that improving the ecosystem services through improving the ecosystem as a whole can lead to increased crop production as well as increased human health. Right, so who am I? I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hamilton, and you can reach me at the information provided here, this is my direct email address, both for the nonprofit and the business. I have advanced degrees in evolutionary biology and research specifically plant microbial interactions, focusing on the mutualistic interactions that happen and led to a lab-owned patent on mutualistic fungi specific to agriculture that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. Any questions about that? I can provide you later. I need to keep this at 30 minutes. And the last time I tested my timing, it was 57. So I reduced it a lot. So we're going to cover basically everything I have time to about hedgerows in terms of their use for biodiversity conservation, the abiotic and biotic components, and the results of consideration of those components on things like arthropod and bird abundance, air quality, changes in wind and impacts on crops, water quality and quantity moving through a cropping system. I'm not going to get into barriers and opportunities to address hedgerows because I don't have time. And then just a real quick review of some of the biodiversity benefits above and below ground. But this is really interlaced throughout the presentation. Right, so what is a hedgerow? First of all, I want to let you know that in the literature that I've reviewed, hedgerow is also called a fence row and also called shelter belts. That shelter belt seemed like a weird name to me at first until I started looking at the research on wind impacts or reduced impacts of wind and pollution on wind as a result of hedgerows. Right, so they're basically going to be some sort of complex plant community. They're going to be more complex than the crops typically that they're adjacent to. And that means that they're going to have maybe 11 species instead of what you might find in a field might be 3 or 4 species. Or if you are lucky enough to live in a very diverse, say, prairie land habitat, you could have 50 species in there of different ephemeral grasses and shrubs, forbs, etc. Or if you have the ability to have the thicker hedgerows, you might have everything from oak trees to dogwoods to a plethora of sedges and grasses. If you're living next to, if you want to plant your hedgerows or can plant your hedgerows next to waterways, it's going to change their diversity as well. So a lot of this is really context dependent, and I will repeat that for, I think, good reason, this idea of context dependence. So historically, hedgerows were a way to fence off properties that were also a way to maintain the wildlife that was indigenous to the area so that agriculturalists, farmers could also hunt for their food, right? They could get their protein resources in the hedgerows while they grew their vegetable resources. And they also were a great way to buffer crops from pests that might move from one agricultural field to the next. So actually a wall, so to speak, keeping those pests movements reduced. And not just because it's a physical barrier, but because you're going to have increased bug diversity and bird diversity in your hedgerows, which means those pests, if they move through the hedgerow to another crop, are more likely to get eaten or parasitized. So ecological communities are aggregates or groups of organisms that are interacting with each other and also the abiotic, the non-living community around them. So biodiversity conservation by use of hedgerows, especially if we have connective hedgerows that are connecting to forest areas, to maybe greenways in a city, to each other's farms, that provides a corridor through which birds, mammals, arthropods can navigate and get from maybe a space that's being heavily polluted and they're dying to another space that's more hospitable, and therefore they can create source populations within those hedgerows or the areas that those hedgerows connect to, and then the hedgerow is a sink and a source, right? So it's a sink for what's coming up from the forest, and it's a source from what's going out to crops. Some of the abiotic components to think about are things like, the biological components to think about when you are developing your hedgerow is the diversity of plants that you're going to have. So higher diversity generally means a higher or a healthier habitat. So what is a healthy habitat? It's a habitat that has a lot of niches that are being utilized and maximized. What is a niche? Okay, so the analogy I like to use is, say, if you have a bank account of this much money, you have to niche partition how you're going to spend those different funds, right? So you're going to allocate funding to healthcare, you're going to allocate funding to your children's education, you're going to allocate funding to monthly expenses, you're going to allocate funding to XYZ, right? So you are partitioning your resources into these different needs areas. Those needs areas are competing with each other, right? For a limited pool. Resources are also limited. But a great way to reduce the competition of many, many organisms that might feed on those resources, those limited resources in a habitat, is what evolutionary selection has done, or natural selection has done. The example that's paramount or most thought of in evolutionary ecology is bird beak size. So if you have an island of birds, and you're going to end up having birds with a huge variation in beak size and shape. You're going to have large beaked birds that can get through very large seeds and holes. You're going to have teeny tiny, very narrow shaped beaks that are great at getting into crevices, tiny crevices, to eat small insects and other arthropods. And then you're going to have every size in between to eat different seed sizes, to have maybe a crossbill that allows you to get into a different type of seed size, or maybe the birds will specialize on fruit instead of the actual seed in the fruit. That is resource partitioning, and it reduces competition, and it can lead the community as a whole, or I'm going to say community as a whole, to a quasi-stable state. Soil fertility is a result of the microbial abundance and microbial diversity, as well as arthropod diversity and abundance below ground. Without those arthropods and microbes, you don't have organic matter that's broken down into constituent parts that the plant can then uptake as macronutrients and micronutrients. You don't have it broken down into parts that your mycorrhizal and other fungal benefactors and bacterial helpers of plants can break down for their own use, so that they can then release compounds the plants use to remain healthy. And if you don't have diversity of arthropods, the plants are your primary trophic level, right? The primary food level. Everything eats plants, or everything eats something that eats plants. Well, right above that are your arthropods, right? So a lot of things thrive and survive on arthropods. They're abundant, they should be, or used to be. And so they have great protein resources, great fat resources in them. Bears eat arthropods, birds, most birds rely primarily on insects for a healthy diet. Seeds are not sufficient. And then you've also got, just as my train of thought, a bunch of other things. Oh, amphibians. So freshwater species are critical for the organisms that survive in and around freshwater habitats. I don't know how this is going to go now. Right, so the abiotic components are things like soil quality, water quality, and then all of those contributing to the food quality. With the food quality we eat as the food quality, as well as the food quality for any of the other biological organisms. I'm not going to get into the pedology and soil formation because we'll talk about that later, and you're going to get great presentations by others about that. So just focusing here on air and water quality. If you have a diverse and then lots of different layers, if you live in an area where the indigenous plant species allow for a lot of different layers and a height and width, you're going to get a suite of ecosystem services that will benefit air quality as well as water quality. Even if you live in a prairie area where the indigenous flora is going to lead to a prairie-like habitat for your hedgerows, you're still going to get a tremendous amount of ecosystem benefits, but perhaps not the same in terms of air quality. So plants are literally filters, both above ground and below ground. They reduce the uptake of, let's see, yeah, I'm going to go stay there. So they reduce the flow through of heavy metals. So having diverse hedgerows incorporated in our Department of Transportation, our federal roadways and our state roadways would be an excellent way to reduce the accumulation of arsenic, nickel, lead, and other toxic metals into the soils around those roadways, because those get drip off our cars, so to speak, and then run into those sewer or the groundwater adjacent to those roadways. And if there's a lot, if you have just turf that's mowed down, it's going to move past that system, right, past that local system that's adjacent to the roadways. If you have hedgerows and a lot of diversity, with microbial diversity in those transportation systems or corridors, you're going to have sequestration of those heavy metals as well as other pollutants. Same thing's going to happen if you have hedgerows adjacent to a farm. You're going to be able to sequester some of the nitrogen and phosphorus, keeping it from moving into, say, the Gulf and creating hypoxic zones. And then you're also going to have reduced erosion. So that's going to maintain healthy freshwater streams. It's going to reduce different chemistries that get into the crops from our application of them, and potentially in the groundwater, because those roots and the microbes around those roots are going to uptake a lot of that and sequester it. So they clean water, they reduce the flow of water, they clean air, because plants literally have like sticky substances on the surface of their leaves, and then they've got hairs as well on the surface of the leaves, both of which can lead to the attraction of this particulate matter and just getting caught, basically. And conifers are as good at this as broadleaf trees. So the food quality of a plant is a function of its health. So if you have high to C to N ratios, that's usually an indication of things like growing slowly and also partitioning resources to defense compounds. So maybe those plants are getting not a lot of fertilization, right? They're just getting ambient fertilization. And because they have to deal with maybe a lot of pests, they're increasing their carbon accumulation because that's not particularly palatable. We all know a more delicious plant is one that's got a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's not only more palatable, but it also gives us a lot more nitrogen compounds to use in amino acids, which for us and bugs and birds are foundational to the production of amino acids and the proteins that are involved in absolutely every aspect of cells, intra and extracellular, or inter and intracellular. So antioxidant levels can also be higher in plants that are treated well and provided a lot of resources that are accessed through their microbial partners. Right, so in this particular study, so I'm going to get into some studies, and I changed, that's good. Holden et al. Explored hedges, so these are just hedgerows, a mixture of small trees, 11 different species, margins, so these were non-pasture grasslands that were adjacent to these great pastures that are intermittently grazed. And then the pastures, they're right here. So these are permanent grasslands with periodic sheep grazing and also used for silage twice a year, they're mowed. And then we have arable cropland that was used for wheat, winter wheat, barley, and oil rapeseed production. And what they found, and they have a tremendous amount of data, so I definitely recommend perusing this paper for all of the impacts of hedgerows, this particular type of hedgerow anyway. So hydraulic conductance under saturation. So when soils are saturated, usually the ion transmission or movement from a soil particle colloid to a root is going to be inhibited simply by the water, right? But what they found is that under saturation in the hedgerows, they had higher conductivity. So those ions are able to move better in hedgerows, significantly better than they are in pastures. Okay, so grasslands with some sheep wandering around, and also significantly better than in the cropland, right? Not much difference with the margin, so that's sort of the interface between these two spaces, right? So it makes sense that it wouldn't be significant different from this or this, because this is going to be really more variable, probably in plant community and thus microbial community. They don't have a causal mechanism, and you'll see that that's true of much of the research that's being done right now. So we're really in the nascent stages of doing research around this in the US. UK's got a lot more research dollars going into this, but first you have to identify patterns and then look for causal, because correlation is not causation, right? Right. So lots of opportunities to do research, and if anyone wants to include me and fund me in those opportunities so that I can do some of that research, please contact me. So hedges, in terms of total nitrogen concentration, so this is the nitrogen that's available in the soil, significantly higher in hedges and pasture lands, no significant difference between those two. And then we have significantly higher in, or not significantly different, it looks like it is from the error bars. These must be standard error bars. So they're not significantly different between arable margins. Again, the role probably of microbial community members is retaining and increasing, as well as arthropods, retaining and increasing organic matter and the distribution of and conservation of nitrogen within these soils, probably some architectural changes in these soils as well. It's interesting that it's not in the margins. Maybe that's because uptake is higher, or because some of it's getting pulled off due to changes in hydroflow between the margins and the arable land. I don't know, but interesting patterns. All right, so meta-analysis review by Bob Albrecht et al. I really recommend going to meta-analyses or review papers as your first exploration into the literature, because it can give you some big pictures. Let's see, so what are the patterns we have here? Well, if you look at the graphs, you'll see that, so there's two different types of things going on here, right? I don't know what this is. Okay, there we go, that's what that is. Okay. We have with planting a hedgerow and without planting a hedgerow. As you can see, the pest control services, so the number of parasitoids and arthropods that eat other bugs and fungi, those are higher when it's adjacent in the hedgerow and then closer to the hedgerow, and then a less significant difference is present as we get farther into the crop and away from the hedgerow. Pollination services follow the same pattern, but it's much quicker, so that you actually get no significant difference right here, whereas the lack of significant differences, say, 80 meters out, 70 meters out, maybe 60 meters, and the significant difference or loss is probably, let's see, where are these here? Around 40 meters. So the pollination services break down around 40 meters. And even this here is really not that significant, as it's shown in here. Other patterns you can see, overall you get a general increase in pollination services within the plant species in the flower strip because of its richness. So more diversity of species of flowers in the plant strip, more pollination. That makes sense, right? Just more for pollinators and more for pollinator types. And then the time since establishment is also very important. So it increases quite fast, about 2 years, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 years out. Looks like it continues to increase. These are modeled, okay? I'm not actually done because the longest study of the 35 they reviewed were 4 years. The rest of them were under 4 years. So this data, think about only doing a few years of research. That's really not going to tell you much about what's happening in terms of pollinators and beneficial arthropods finding those new hedgerow plantings. Right? It's going to take them a while to find it. Any questions? I want to ask people to ask me now and also, what do you see and think about this data? So this is, I'm not going to raise that up actually. So this research that Henneke et al. Did was looking at what happens to basically 2 different types of crops, one that's pollinated, rapeseed oil, and the other that's not, wheat crops, if they are adjacent to a remnant forest, okay, or if they're found adjacent to a corridor that attaches directly to a remnant forest, or if they're adjacent to an isolated hedgerow. Okay? This being a hedgerow, forest, and isolated hedgerow. They found that both crops combined, hedgerow, had more of the arthropods that ate aphids, a particular type of fly, relative to the forest, the isolated having the least. Even within the different crops, we had the same pattern. So oil or wheat adjacent to the hedge, going to have more aphid-eating pests, insect predators, and isolated going to have the least. Oil rapeseed tended to attract or somehow be correlated positively with more of those aphid eating. Do these crops get more aphids than wheat? I don't know. You guys can tell me that. And their conclusion was to increase hedgerow present in agricultural matrices and integrate context, right? So if you're going to use flowering crops, that's going to depend upon the crop that you're growing, say whether it needs to be pollinated or not, what types of pests it attracts, the proximity to the source population. Like if you are close to a potential source like a forest, or you are way out, adjacent to a suburb and you've lost a lot of source populations, you might plant a different type of hedgerow. So what would you do in your context is a question I'd really appreciate you making a note about so that we can talk about it again, as long as I can get through this fast enough to give you an opportunity to engage. So I'll move on. Four major services that arthropods provide include decomposition, which we've already talked about. So they chew up that organic matter, as you know, and they make macro and micronutrients available to the microbes and eventually available to plants, changing also the soil pH and its physical structure. Predators and parasites of plant pests are among many of the arthropod species. They are low and important on the food web of life, so lots of things eat them and rely on them as a food source. They're high in fat, high in protein. That chitin is incredibly important for fungal growth and productivity. And then, of course, we have pollinators. Sadly, we're losing them at a massive rate. So these hedgerows could provide us a way to slow this loss of surveyed arthropods. I wanted to point out this survey was done from 1990 to 2015 in a forest. It was looking at only flying insects, and you can see with the exception of a few species, all of them continue to be in decline. This isn't a protected space. So one of the hypotheses is that this decline is occurring as a result of the quality of the forest being reduced by the inflow of pesticides and various chemicals moving on the air currents, which, air and water don't care about boundaries. So I just wanted to show some of the causes of arthropod losses here. They're not going to be new to you. Habitat loss and degradation is critical, it's way up there. So declining in the habitat that I see in the city that I live in, which is growing really, really fast. I moved to it because it was a small city with lots of beautiful green hills of tall trees, and those are getting clear cut for new developments to go in. And we don't need to develop that way. We can do other things. So the intensive agriculture could be done differently. It might cost a little more, but if we all agree to reduce our profit margins and spread the wealth, well, it would be a different world. Agricultural environmental schemes that incentivize habitat improvement, say grazing on private lands, not just public lands, employing agro-silvopastoral systems in urban and rural agriculture would go a long way. Some solutions to pesticide and pollution issues are, of course, organic farming, incorporating more beneficial bugs, introducing them into your landscapes, using the types of things like biochar and microbials to feed your soils, and creating a more heterogeneous landscape, both above and below ground through the use of the hedgerows, invasive species, having governments operate as an invasive plant removal program. So regulation and oversight is needed in a lot of ways in our community. It's what government can do best if it's provided the opportunity to do so. And that didn't work. Get rid of that. I'll fix it later. And let's see. That would also need, in order for those to be successful, you need monitoring and assessment and program improvement opportunities to be pervasive and maybe an independent body regulating it. And then in climate change, we need active management of roadsides for wildlife through planting native vegetation, active management of hedgerows by planting native vegetation, increasing carbon storage and restoration through preservation of trees, especially old trees, which provide a lot more services, etc. So, air quality changes from hedgerows include just the fact that we talked about before. Plants literally, especially the canopies, act as a particulate matter air filter. They can also physically block the spread of chemistries that are being sprayed, as well as diseases. So as many of you may be aware, a lot of the wheat rust diseases move in the airstream to us all the way from China. The wheat rust is globally distributed, and that's because those particles are super light, they get way high in that air, and the air currents don't care about human animals. One of the researchers found that indicated reductions of negative impacts due to these nice, tall, thick hedgerows was 90% of ammonia emissions reduced, 20% of particulate matter, and then the reduction by 5% of these two very strong greenhouse gases. I think, and they have hypothesized this as well, that these three reductions are a result of a robust rich microbial community being able to uptake the nitrate, the carbon, and also the not volatilizing through respiration, utilizing the nitrite compounds instead of having those just get leached out or flooded out and then volatilize into the air column. All right, so there's not a lot of great science available, sadly. We don't have a lot of funding for it. I mean, we need more EPA funding for this. Again, why agencies are so important and often not perfect, but certainly underappreciated for what they provide us. One research found that in roadways, you create these tunnels, these air tunnels with perpendicular rows of trees versus thick, not necessarily thick, but contiguous trees lining either side versus island being planted by trees. And what they found is that 46 to 61% of particulate matter could be reduced depending upon the size of the roadway and whether you have perpendicular being the lowest or horizontal on either side being the highest particulate matter reduction, right? So context and design specific. I might actually get it through this one. This, I really love this one. This research that you can't see, and I'm not sure why it's not presenting as well. Let's try going back to it. I don't know why things just got weird. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is great. This shows you all of the different types of benefits that are provided. Changing the title of that as a result of different types of hedgerows. So you're not going to get a lot of pollinator services from conifers, but you're going to get tremendous particulate matter and spray and dust drift blocked as a result of conifers and shrubs. Flowering plants are going to add the component of pollinators. Trees are going to add nesting habitats. Forbs and grasses are going to provide ground nesting bird habitats. Both of them provide overwintering for beneficial bugs and other microbes. And they all provide refuges from pesticides and can have positive consequences to amount of fertilizers leaching from the system, as well as soil erosion reduction and increased water quality. So wind throws, they actually act as a physical barrier to wind and wind damage and the changes in evapotranspiration as a result of wind exposure. There's 3 great studies that I cite here that show some differences in results, and I think better again exemplify that context-dependent results of working with different crops, different types of hedgerows, different thicknesses of hedgerows, and also interestingly, where those hedgerows might be located versus windward or leeward side. So in Whitehouse et al., they found that their models looked at hedgerow effects on wind and the result on dew. I'll just make it simple. Dew, precipitation, soil moisture, evapotranspiration, and wind speed. As you can see, the wind side is going to dry out, right? But if you have your hedgerows and your crops situated against the wind primarily, you're going to have increased dew formation, increased precipitation, probably as a result of evapotranspiration coming from these large hedgerows. This is the mountain effect, right? That's going to lead to increased soil moisture, reduction in evapotranspiration, and they also block wind speed, which will have, an impact on this dew formation and precipitation. How far out it has an impact or benefit to your crops. Certainly, physical damage to the crops and the soil through soil erosion is going to be reduced if you have hedgerows, and that's going to depend on the proximity of the hedgerows. You can imagine that massively high hedgerows surrounding this might not have much of an impact. So you might have a lot of central crop reduction and peripheral crop savings and soil savings. Soil temperature below and at ground level were also significantly higher in hedgerow areas. I think this is probably a result, I'm hypothesizing, a result of increased respiration and the release of heat as a result of those energetic exchanges in microbial bodies, from microbial bodies, and also plant roots and plant root turnover. So yeah, I would love to know also at the end, what is some of the consequences when that you've experienced here in Virginia and other places that you're coming from, growing in? Water quality we talked about. This is again going to be context dependent. There's some nice work being done between conventional farmers and USDA, collaborations for soil and water quality improvements. And so these are some grants you might want to look forward to get engaged with. Habitat conservation has been considered a critical component and is resulting in a collaboration between NRCS and Xerces Foundation to determine how things like hedgerows and other types of agricultural management impact aquatic invertebrates and amphibians that rely on them. So clean water ecosystems, the surface water ecosystems that are impacted by agriculture. Other funding opportunities you might explore, you guys are probably much better informed about these than I am, but I just wanted to look up a few things and see if I could find anything. EQIP is one, and then conservation land payments are another that I found readily in a short search. And if there's others that you want to talk about, I can list them on the slide. We're going to make the slide deck available, and then y'all will have access to information. Hypoxic zones are increasing. They're rapidly increasing in the Gulf, and hedgerows have a real opportunity to disrupt these hydroflow pathways that are causing massive fish die-offs. And economic consequences and health consequences, because there's a lot of health consequences as a result of this eutrophication in these zones. So people living along the Gulf areas next to these are often unaware that there's a lot of lung damage that can happen as a result of living in proximity to these areas. Right, so you get reduced bulk density. So reduced bulk density means you're going to have increased water infiltration through the soil layers, the soil zones, and that means less water flow out into the Gulf. Increased porosity and topsoil permeability by 20 to 27 times is found by some research done by citation. No, I don't have it off the top of my head. And they also found that hedgerow soils can store up to 640 to 650% more nitrate than the crop soils, and almost 4,000% more sediment. As you can see, there's a lot of variation. That, well, at least like this, and that variation is going to be a result of the size of the crop, the size of the hedgerow, the direction of wind flows in the hedgerow. You know, we've been through it, so it's all context dependent. Here's a summary here. I think some of the next questions I'm led to are, why aren't hedgerows everywhere? What are you familiar with to this? What are some of your thoughts? And in the EU, there are greening measures that are required, and hedgerows are included as a greening measure that's accountable, that are required before any kind of funding grant or loan funding can be provided by the government. So can we do something like that here? How do we kind of expand those patterns to people in the community who might be more resistant? It's way beyond my knowledge base. So here's some citations. I'll get you that one for the hydroflows soon. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this and engage with me. And yeah, give me an opportunity to learn from you as well.